Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Dr. Zachary Gorman, who is the academic coordinator at none other than the Robert Menzies Institute. So welcome to Afternoon Light today, Zach.
Thank you.
And today we're talking about the sixth Prime Minister of Australia, Joseph Cook. So not Menzies for a change, but someone else, one of his predecessors. And Joseph Cook is a much underrated and a much overlooked Prime Minister in Australian history, I guess mainly because he wasn't Prime Minister for very long.
Yeah, he had 450 days, which is the shortest term of anyone to actually win an election, because he ended up taking a double dissolution that backfired in circumstances where the First World War broke out.
Oh, right. And tell me, how did Joseph Cook come into politics? Because he has the most extraordinary pull himself up by his bootstrap story. I should say, actually, you've just written a biographical monograph on Joseph Cook, and it's part of the Australian biographical monograph series that is being published by Connor Court. And this is the latest edition. So it's a nice, quick, easy read. It's an affordable read, and it's a riveting read. And as I was reading about Joseph Cook's early life, I thought, gee, it was pretty tough back then. And kids these days, I don't mean to sound like some old codger, but kids these days do have it pretty easy compared to Joseph Cook in the 19th century.
Certainly, he's definitely the complete opposite of what we might call victim mentality of today. He was born in the Staffordshire mining town of Silverdale in 1860, which is a child of the Industrial Revolution. It's one of those ones that crops up because there is coal and iron available to mine, and then you get these sort of associated industries around there. But it's very sort of dark. The town is named after the silver birch trees that used to grow there, but by the time Cook's born, it's all gone. It's all just industrial wasteland. And he's born as the eldest son of the family, and his father is a miner, but he's sort of a slightly privileged miner in that he's the miner who looks after a particular shaft and makes sure that enough mining happens in that particular day to keep the bosses happy. But even that is not privileged enough to prevent him from getting killed in a mining accident, where Joseph is 12 years old, and Joseph becomes the family breadwinner at just the age of 12, after already being in the mines from the age of 9 as a pit boy, sort of attending to pit ponies and machinery and all these sorts of things. So yeah, very grim 19th century. All the stereotypes that you might have about England in the 19th century very much embodied in Cook's childhood. But that never sort of overwhelmed him. He was always in this mindset, and certainly his family encouraged him to be in this mindset. So it's not just Cook who succeeds in getting out of Silverdale and getting out of that existence. All of his siblings that actually live into adulthood actually have quite successful careers, but not all of his siblings live into adulthood because he has a brother who's killed in another mining accident. It is a very sort of fragile existence in the mines. But he has this empowerment philosophy, this self-improvement philosophy. He reads the American author Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about these sort of empowerment themes, but he also has devout understanding of Methodism. His family's very religious. And the whole sort of idea of Methodism is that it's very much about the ability of the studious and moral individual to improve their lot in life and improve their world around them. So despite being in the mines from the age of 12, Cook goes out of his way to sort of self-educate. So whenever he has a spare moment not in the mines, he'll be reading or practicing his arithmetic and these sorts of things, even to the point when later in life a journalist asked him how his experience in the mines was, and he replied with a wry smile that it was an occupation for a philosopher.
As in, you had a fair amount of time to think while you were doing something mundane, I guess, was his implication. So what were the educational opportunities for a 9-year-old boy in the mines. He did attend school, didn't he? I mean, he's obviously got an amazing amount of get up and go, doing his own study, practicing arithmetic himself, reading widely as one can in a situation that he finds himself. But there were some limited educational opportunities, weren't there?
Yeah, so when he's very young, I think it's in 1870, the Gladstone government passes an Education Act, which is a very limited education act compared to even what might be going on in Australia at the time. It leaves it up to sort of local councils to decide if they're going to make schooling compulsory, and then the councils are also granted the ability to levy rates specifically to fund those public schools. And this happens to Cook. He does get taken out of the mines, but only sort of very briefly. My understanding is that the primary education was only to 12. So it gets passed in 1870 where he's 10. He was already back in the mines by the time his father passed away, making his position in the mines an absolute necessity.
Now, you said his father, who obviously died when Joseph Cook was 12, had a slightly elevated position in the particular mine he was working in, looking after a particular shaft. Was he political at all?
Not as far as we can tell, but he did have this idea that he was going places, that he might be able to earn his way out. And certainly the family moves home a couple of times in Silverdale to slightly larger, slightly more impressive places, but they were never great places. I mean, Cook only owned one pair of shoes as a child. The houses were often infested with rats because the town had this creek that ran brown from colliery wastewater that used to be absolutely swarming with rats. It was not a pleasant existence, but there was still something that you might describe as sort of middle-class values or some sort of aspirational values that were very much imbued with him at an early age and that he kept with him throughout his life.
So he's the breadwinner from 12, working in the mines, which is a pretty precarious occupation. The fatality rate was unacceptably high, particularly by today's standards. But he's developing a worldview and some ideas about how he thinks the world should work with that deeply religious background. How is he in those early years thinking about philosophy and about political ideas?
Well, you're right in that religion is very central to him, that he becomes a lay preacher and he's even sort of preaching once he's Prime Minister. He's still giving speeches to Methodist organisations that have a clear religious bent. He even gets offered a position to study at the New Connection College in Ranmore, which is this big sort of Methodist college where all the great preachers come out of, but he has to turn down the opportunity to continue to provide for his mother and siblings. But he definitely is a Gladstonian liberal in his earliest days in the sense that he is in a liberal club while he's in England. You can always see, because Cook's always been attacked as a model of political inconsistency because he's the first of the Labor rats. He's the first person to sort of leave the Labor Party and become a very prominent figure on the centre-right of politics. But there are definitely aspects of his philosophy that are consistent, even if he did sort of change his views on specific policy matters over the years. And I think that empowerment philosophy, and that was what Gladstonian liberalism was always about. And this is why Australian liberalism, the word liberalism, means something different compared to elsewhere in the world, because we are just a time capsule of Gladstonian liberalism. And Gladstonian liberalism was never about equality of outcomes. It was always about equality of opportunities, giving people a leg up and then allowing their talents and ambitions and work ethic to determine how far they would go in life. And most certainly Cook went very far in life because he had an incredible work ethic. That's the one thing everyone always says about him, even later on where you have the Fusion Liberal Party and Alfred Deakin is retiring and they got to decide who is going to be the leader. Deakin, very surprisingly, votes for Cook as the free trader over the protectionist candidate just because he appreciates that no one's going to work harder to make the Liberal Party work than Joseph Cook.
But it's interesting he's coming to the Liberal tradition rather than the Labor tradition, given he's from a working class background, he's in the mines, and yet he sees the merits of reward for effort, of diligence, of being given opportunities, and it's up to you to make the most of them, rather than this sort of capital versus labour, the workers against the big bosses, socialisation of industry to take away the power of capital all over the masses that was presented by the labour movement, trade union movement at the time.
Yeah, so he is a very prominent trade unionist, which is ultimately how he enters politics. But for him, trade unionism was about securing sort of necessary reforms, most of which had to do with safety. Like a lot of them, he was just lobbying for there to be more cubic feet of air per miner and things like that to be able to breathe properly.
Looking at the statistics was a fair enough point, given what was happening in the mines.
But he certainly never bought into a sort of class warfare type. Again, from his father, if you want to talk in those sort of terms, was a collaborator. He was working with the boss, and that was always who Cook was. Cook was always willing to work with the bosses and negotiate on really sort of equal terms, and he got a lot done through that. He always opposed unnecessary strikes. He really didn't feel that the strike mechanism and that militant unionism ever accomplished much.
So we're talking about Cook in Britain, in England, in Staffordshire, in Silverdale, without the silver birches. But we know this story is about Australia's sixth Prime Minister. So, of course, the essential next step is for Cook to travel to Australia, which was something a lot of people were doing at the time, migrating to Australia from England, from Scotland. What was his journey like, and why did he undertake the journey? Because he was doing this freely. He wasn't a convict, of course. He was a free settler.
Yeah, so an economic downturn really makes things bad for him in Silverdale, and he ultimately has to sort of leave Silverdale, and he's sort of mulling up his options. He marries a school teacher named Mary Turner, and marrying a school teacher turns out to be great for him because he basically gets to complete his education through his wife. His wife actually ensures that he learns mathematics so well that he ultimately becomes an accountant to supplement his mining income. That's how good she was at that. And Mary's brother had already emigrated to Australia, and he's very much selling it to them that there's so many jobs over here, it's so much better. And Cook resolves that he's already brought up one family, the family of his siblings, in tremendously harsh conditions, and he does not want to have to repeat the process again. He needs to be somewhere where there are more opportunities, and that's what he finds in Australia. He sails out of Plymouth on Christmas Day 1885, leaving a pregnant Mary behind in England, makes his way to Lithgow, which is very much an Australian version of Silverdale in that it's one of these intense sort of mining towns. And he quickly establishes himself as a figure in the Lithgow community. He builds a family home with his bare hands initially, and that's why Mary is able to emigrate out. He supplements his mining work by becoming an accountant, so he becomes more and more sort of not only wealthy compared to other miners, but because he's keeping books for mine owners, he's keeping books for local council, he's becoming more and more of a sort of public figure. He becomes president of his trade union lodge and is campaigning on public issues, for example, trying to stop a mine being built under Lithgow's water supply. So he really does find himself in Australia quite quickly.
It's amazing to think of that journey and then finding yourself in Lithgow. He obviously had a brother-in-law there, but it wasn't like the welfare state was there to support you. You'd made this choice. You had to, presumably he had some savings in order to get himself off the ground, but he was relying on his own amazing capacity to work and persist.
Yeah, he definitely just took the punt. There was just a real lack of alternatives at the time, really. Like, it was an act of desperation always. It's simultaneously an act of desperation and an act of hope to move to Australia. That you do hope that he's going to live up to what your brother-in-law is saying and that will be so much a better place. But at the same time, to go literally to the other side of the world at a time when there was so little communications, what you're hearing through this letter is a very sort of scanty understanding of what a new society will be. But it really does live up to the hype, 100% for Cook. Cook, later in life, he would describe Australia as the land of the better chance when he first returns to England in 1918. And he eventually, in the 1920s, he's High Commissioner in London, and he leads this major advertising campaign selling Australia to migrants as the land of the better chance. That's the slogan. That's the sort of ScoMo-style slogan. And it really works. The immigration rates are the highest level they ever attained between 1901 and that sort of post-war boom, when it's Cook as the salesman selling Australia to migrants.
And also, I guess people were hearing stories of relatives, like Joseph Cook's wife had heard the story of her brother. So there was a sense that, well, if my brother-in-law's made it over there, then it's possible that we can also make it over there. They had that reliable third-party endorsement, but still a huge punt on the land of the better chance. So Joseph Cook is head of his trade union lodge and getting involved in Labor politics. But what makes him run for office, and obviously as part of the Labor Party?
So you have in 1890 what's referred to as the Great Maritime Strike, which is initially a strike that's all about these officers that want to affiliate with the Melbourne Trades Hall, and the maritime owners don't want them to do that. And it just expands exponentially with all these sort of sympathy strikes, so that it really becomes a sort of nationwide battle of capital versus labour. And Cook, as I've already sort of alluded to, he's very anti the strike mechanism. He particularly hates the idea of it's just a sympathy strike. It's not even his issue that is forcing the miners to stop working. So he delays Lithgow joining in the strikes until he gets compelled by the broader union organisation, union hierarchy. Lithgow's the last mining district to join in the strike after both Newcastle and the sort of Illawarra region. And the strike's failure ultimately leads to the birth of the Labor Party, because unionists conclude that the strike mechanism, as Cook could have warned them, the strike mechanism fails, it doesn't achieve anything. So they decide that they're going to get elected to Parliament instead. And because he's such a prominent figure in the community, he puts up his hand to stand for Lithgow's seat of Hartley. But the Labor Party is a bit sort of cautious in Hartley. 2 people are returned for the seat at the time, and they only want to put up one candidate because they don't want to divide their efforts. And he ultimately loses the pre-selection by something like 3 votes to another reverend. It's crazy that the Labor Party at this time was so inculcated in this sort of Methodist, real Christian traditions. But Guy ultimately gets sick and the candidacy falls to Cook, and he tops the poll quite comfortably.
So he's in the New South Wales Parliament as the member for Hartley. Does he make much of a name for himself there?
Yes, he quickly emerges as the sort of leader of the free trade faction of the Labor Party. So the Labor Party is heavily divided in its first term over the fiscal issue of free trade versus protectionism, which was then the dividing line in politics. What were arguably New South Wales' first political parties that only emerged in 1887, where candidates split into camps based on their attitude towards the issue. And Labor tries to come into the Parliament with this new way of thinking, but ultimately they can't divorce themselves from the political culture. That issue is still too great to be ignored, and the party repeatedly divides over the issue in that first term. And ultimately, the extra parliamentary organisation gets very frustrated at these divisions, and they try to enforce discipline ahead of the 1894 election, the second election the Labor Party will ever face. And one of the things they do is to get the party to finally elect a leader, because the Labor Party was so sort of utopian in its early years that it didn't even have a parliamentary leader. They were trying to rule by committee, which is one of the reasons they were running around like headless chooks and always voting on opposite sides of the House, because they had no direction, no leadership. And Cook ultimately gets elected as the first parliamentary leader of the New South Wales Labor Party. And it's based on his powers as a speaker, but also, once again, that work ethic that he's memorised parliamentary procedures. He's the one that's always in Parliament at a time when parliamentary attendance was incredibly low. It was very often that members just wouldn't turn up for days at a time. But Cook's always there. He always had that sort of work ethic, and people saw that in him from an early day.
So the Labor Party's run in 2 elections. How's it doing by this stage?
So it does really well in the 1891 election. It wins over 30 seats completely out of the blue.
Out of?
It's something like 150.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a completely new force. It wins the balance of power immediately. It will determine, as long as it can vote as a bloc, it will determine whether the protectionists or the free traders are in government. But of course, it can't vote as a bloc because it keeps splitting over the issue. And it's ahead of the 1894 poll. The other thing they do to enforce discipline is to institute the pledge to vote as a majority of caucus decides on any issue affecting the Labor platform or the fate of the government. And the latter clause actually means that caucus will decide anything, because the nature of politics at the time, the Parkes government had gone down over an adjournment motion in 1891. So any vote affected the fate of the government when the House was so divided. So the caucus is going to control absolutely everything. And this leads to the first Labor split. It hasn't even been in office for a full term yet, and it divides straight away, and Cook becomes leader of the independent Laborites, the men who won't submit to the pledge. He delivers this extended manifesto where he says he'll refuse to be a slave. His whole life had involved earning a moral and material independence for himself, where he'd be able to make decisions on his own as a man, and he's just not going to surrender his conscience. And he actually attracts the support, being the leader of the parliamentary members. The vast majority of the parliamentary members support him. At the 1894 election, there's actually 2 Labor parties running, and the Pledge Party actually succeeds slightly more. There are only 8 of these independent Laborites that ultimately succeed. But Cook maintains throughout the rest of his life that the original Labor Party of 1891 and the pledged entity of 1894 are separate, that he was never a member of what we now know as the Labor Party. There was an original Labor Party that lasted 1 term.
Right. But fundamentally, he doesn't want to be dictated to by caucus. It's interesting, though, when you reflect on the history of political parties and their successes in Australia. I mean, having a sense of parliamentary discipline gives the party its power, because there is some reliability that they're elected on a certain policy platform and that they're going to vote along the lines of what they've committed to. Whereas Cook was sort of advocating for, I can just decide as an individual what I think's right, rather than be bound by any sense of discipline.
Yes, certainly Australian politics has evolved to become more disciplined since Cook's day. But it was a very vital issue early on. This is something that the Liberals as a wider political movement, really fundamentally thought that you needed to be able to have that freedom of conscience, because it also played into your role as an MP. So for Cook, you needed to be able to make promises to your electorate, and your promise to your electorate mattered more than doing what caucus wanted. Your electorate mattered more than that. But it also plays into the sort of Burkean idea of a member who's not meant to be beholden to anyone, certainly not beholden to an outside and frankly sectional force, that you're instead meant to make up your own independent judgment on what constitutes the national interest. And Judith Brett has gone so far as to argue that this issue is the dividing line of Australian politics early on, because it's the issue that makes Deakin end up on the centre-right when he otherwise agrees with many Labor policies.
It's really interesting to reflect on how different politics is then these days, where there is almost a disconnect between most MPs and their electorate in terms of their ability to make promises specific to their electorate outside of the power of their party to influence their vote in Parliament. I mean, what Cook was advocating for, what he stood by, is much more purely representative of democracy. But it goes against our sort of 2-party political system that we're all very familiar with.
Yeah, it got in the way of reality. And it is interesting that there is a sort of contrast between Cook's idea of that direct representative and the Burkean idea, because the Burkean idea is that you're not even beholden to your electorate, that you're meant to be truly independent in matters of judgment. But Cook initially really felt that what the caucus Labor was doing would completely backfire. He thought that no one would vote for a politician that couldn't make outright pledges to their electorate, but he turned out to be quite wrong in that.
Yes, yeah, well, history has shown him to be completely wrong. So in the 1890s, there was obviously issues within the brand new Labor Party, as you've described, but of course it was the time of the constitutional conventions. The colonies were getting ready to form Federation, Commonwealth of Australia, and these were the debates that gripped the nation. Well, not that it was a nation at the time. What was Cook's attitude towards federation? Of course, that's totally coloured by him being from New South Wales, which had its own view of federation being the biggest and most powerful of the colonies.
So his views on federation are coloured by his being from New South Wales, but also his lingering attachment to the trade union movement and also his experiences in the trade union movement. Because one of the things that dealing with both Labor Party extra-parliamentary organisation and the union organisation had taught him was the value of subsidiarity, the value of actually making decisions on the most local level, which is practical, making decisions in Lithgow rather than making decisions in Sydney. And that feeds into him being opposed, certainly at the first poll in 1898, to the federation model because he doesn't want unnecessary centralisation. He agrees with federation on principle, but certainly the model, he thinks too many things are going to the federal parliament. But the Labor Party itself is also very opposed to federation because Labor believes that federation is fundamentally undemocratic because you have a Senate that gives equal representation to each state regardless of population. And this is at a time when one of the main political battles that had been fought out was to end what's known as plural voting, which allowed people who owned multiple properties to vote in more than one electorate and instead to establish what was emotively dubbed one man, one vote. And that sort of equal weighting of votes issue was also very important to him. So yeah, he's opposed to centralisation. He's opposed to getting rid of democratic rights. And even later on when he's arguing against constitutional referendums that would enlarge the powers of the federal government, he's still sort of arguing that one of the main reasons why you should leave as many powers as possible to the states is because the states are more democratic, because the states don't have to deal with the conditions of a federal compact where you have that state's upper house.
But was he opposed to the idea of the Commonwealth of Australia? I mean, you've outlined what he was opposed to in terms of, I guess, the structure of the federal government and in terms of the separation of powers between the states and the Commonwealth. And, of course, the way the states were represented in the Senate and the distancing of decision-making from local communities by moving decision-making into Canberra, or what became Canberra, the nation's capital. But the overall concept of bringing the colonies together under one nation, was that something that troubled him? Because it's quite interesting, you go to New South Wales or even here in Victoria, there's a National Gallery of Victoria. It was called the National Gallery of Victoria because it was established at a time when people thought that there would be the country called Victoria and there'd be a country called New South Wales and a country called Western Australia. Like, that was an expectation that this was the nation of Victoria. So he just someone who thought that the whole concept of a nation of Australia was not one to be embraced.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that point because there's a famous Henry Parkes attempt to rename New South Wales as Australia. Because at the time...
That's so very Henry Parkes.
Before the Federation movement and Parkes being able to attach his name to it, he's actually been really opposed to its predecessor known as the Federal Council, which was this looser sort of confederation model where all the states would get together as truly sort of sovereign entities and negotiate things. And New South Wales boycotted it under Henry Parkes. But for Cook, I would say that he was scared of the consequences of federation for free trade. He was an out-and-out free trader. And one of the things that federation proposed to do was not only did you have to join with Victoria and all these states that were explicitly protectionist, but every state apart from New South Wales relied on tariff revenue as their main source of income. In the Constitution itself, you had what's known as the Braddon Clause, which required that 3/4 of tariff revenue was returned to the state. So the Constitution itself was implying that there would definitely be tariffs, that it wouldn't be a free trade nation. But generally speaking, Cook didn't oppose federation in principle because hardly anyone opposed federation in principle. It's very similar to debates on, say, the Republic or the Voice. You always attack the model rather than the idea in broad terms.
But federation happened, and Cook, of course, has to deal in reality, not not idealism. So he enters the federal Parliament, leaves the Parliament of New South Wales. What's his journey like to the federal Parliament?
Yeah, so he doesn't initially want to join the federal Parliament. So even on that level, he's a bit sceptical of federal politics. He doesn't want to have to travel to Melbourne constantly. And he is initially just going to stick in state politics in the hopes of becoming premier. But then it's the Free Trade Party. So Cook is by now, very immediately after the 1894 election, he joins George Reed's Free Traders because George Reed offers him the ministerial position of Postmaster General to ensure that those 8 independent Labor men will continue to vote for Reed in the sort of divided House. He's a free trader, and it's the Free Trade Party that lobbies him to stand for Parramatta because they know how much personal popularity he has, that they're not sure that they'll actually win this seat, but if they have Cook, they know they'll win the seat. And it says a lot about how large the Australian electorates were at the time, and also just the development of Sydney, that at the time the seat of Parramatta contained Lithgow. Right. It's just completely bizarre in modern terms.
Well, back then Parramatta would have not been part of Sydney, would it? It would have been its own separate township. Yeah,
to a certain extent. I mean, it literally had a newspaper called the Fruit Growers Advocate because it was that rural that there was a farming lobby that was that large that its local paper was named after fruit growers. So it's a very different world to the one that we live in today. And that's probably why it was considered a marginal seat that the protectionists might win, because the protectionists in New South Wales, at least, tended to be more successful in the rural seats, that Sydney was the bastion of free trade.
So the protectionists in New South Wales resonated with the agricultural community, was it? The horticulturalists and the like, and the free traders, were they more linked to mining and industrial?
I wouldn't say industrial, because obviously manufacturing is a big one for protectionism, and even the person Cook was opposing in Parramatta was someone who had a sort of iron and steel mill and wanted bounties and all these sort of government interferences in his favour. But certainly one of the reasons why protectionism was so strong in regional New South Wales was because in any sort of border territory where you have to compete with neighbours who are protected by tariffs, it's a sort of jealousy thing.
Sure. Yeah. So Cook's elected the member for Parramatta.
Yeah.
The Federation seat, so important seat, still important to this day. This is the seat of Parramatta, I believe. And he gets involved in these sort of anti-socialist campaigns, doesn't he, quickly in the federal parliament?
So the federal parliament is initially elected, and it's a very similar sort of three-party system to what had existed in New South Wales, with a protectionist government, free trade opposition. They're very close in numbers, the protectionists and the free traders, and then a smaller crossbench Labor Party. And they pass an initial tariff because, tariffs are almost inevitable. With the Braddon Clause, even a bunch of people who are nominally free traders are calling themselves revenue tariffists. So they support having a tariff that will raise money because that's necessary, whereas protectionism, if it works, won't raise any money, because the whole point is that no one's going to try to import something because it will be prohibitively expensive. But eventually that sort of system reaches a stalemate when in 1903 you have the election of the famous 311s, where Labor gains enough seats that it's equal to the other two fiscal parties, and you have this musical chairs of who's going to be Prime Minister. And it's George Reed, Cook's leader, who comes up with a solution to try to fix the 311s, which is to impose clear lines of cleavage and a two-party system on politics. So elections will actually determine who's in government, because in that 1903 to 1906 term, who's in government is just entirely decided by the machinations of politicians. And Reed has a clear issue to go on, because around this time, Labor takes a very sharp turn to the left. It's no longer going to be this sort of gradual reformist party that it had entered politics in the 1890s. In Queensland, you get the adoption of the socialist objective, the full Marxist socialist objective of the nationalisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange. And then in 1905, that's adopted at the federal platform as the slightly milder nationalisation of monopolies and the extension of the industrial and economic functions of the state. So Reid leads this campaign to defend sort of free market capitalism, but also the role of the individual versus the state, that you don't want a state that's so powerful that it's directing everything, that it's going to be dictating to individuals. The individuals will have no choices. And Cook buys into this immediately, that he's already declared that he will refuse to be a slave, refuse to be controlled by outside forces in the Caucasus. He doesn't want a dominating state either. But he is also such an example of how good it is in Australia already, that Australia already has so many opportunities and so much social mobility that he argues it would be the last place in the world where you would want to risk revolution trying to further outdo all of humanity. No one's come up with a better system than the liberal system that had triumphed in Australia in the 19th century. And he reads Edmund Burke, but he also has this sort of Christian concept of natural law, that there are certain things with sort of markets and prices and these sorts of things that are just inevitable. They're baked into the woodwork. You can't overturn them. You can't remake society in a Promethean sense. He says it's one thing to ensure that labour gets its fair apportionment of the fruits of the industrial tree. It's quite another to lay your axe at the root of the tree in a mad endeavour to bring the whole thing down. So you need reforms within the framework of what is logical and consistent and proven, rather than actually trying to create this utopia here in Australia.
But Labor certainly has some support for its platform. I mean, you have Labor Prime Ministers through that period. And when we get to Cook as Prime Minister, he's the sixth Prime Minister. I think it's from 1912, isn't it, to 13. I mean, his federation's been going for 11 years, is that right, by the time he's Prime Minister?
So, yeah, he's elected in 1913.
In 1913. So federation's been going for 12 years, and we've had 6 Prime Ministers. I mean, obviously a lot of toing and froing, and as you say, it's machinations in the Parliament rather than the parties people are voting for determining the majority party forming government so much. But Labor's policies are resonating, aren't they, with a decent rump of the electorate?
Yeah, so it's Labor that's growing, and it's also the anti-socialists. So the Free Traders get rebranded as the anti-socialists for the 1906 election. They're the two parties that are growing, and it's the middle party and the protectionists who are squeezed. They've only got 16 seats after the 1906 election. But what I would say is that while people supported Labor, they didn't want them to implement their entire agenda. There's this bizarre dichotomy very similar to what happens with Menzies and the communism referendum, is that Labor has this socialist platform, explicitly socialist platform, that they have a clear intent of carrying out, but what they need to be able to carry out is constitutional change, because the Constitution doesn't give them the powers to nationalise monopolies and various other things. So they put referendums in both 1911 and 1913. And in 1911, where they try to put them all as a single question, it's absolutely smashed. It's not even close. So they want Labor without Labor being able to actually achieve all the things that they want to achieve. And that's certainly Deakin's sort of attitude towards anti-socialism, is that Deakin wrecks the Reid-Maclean government, which is a short-lived coalition between the fiscal parties. And he argues against anti-socialism initially because he says, well, constitutionally, you aren't able to enact socialism. It's just impossible. But he becomes anti-socialist towards the end of the decade, when Labor are explicitly trying to change the Constitution to be able to enact their platform.
It's interesting how many attempts there were to change the Constitution so soon after it was settled. Because Labor obviously fundamentally disagrees with the Constitution, Section 51, which outlines all the federal government's powers. It just thinks, well, we have a different take on this and we want to rewrite it. I mean, this is putting you on the spot. We're talking about Joseph Cook, not about the history of referenda in Australia, but it'd be interesting to look at how many times the centre-right has put up a referendum versus how many times left governments, Labor governments, have put up referendum.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly the big blocks of lots of referendums at the same time have tended to be Labor. And also the persistence, if they don't vote the right way this time, we'll try again. So in 1911 you have all referendum proposals put into a single question, and then in 1913 they split them up and ask them again, and they're going to do it again in 1915, but eventually Cook, as opposition leader, persuades them that it's a bad thing to do during the war. And they do the exact same thing in the 1940s. In 1944, put a bunch of referendum proposals, all as one question, fail, and then in 1946, ask them a separate question.
I mean, we, of course, have to recognise that Menzies also had his fair share of referendum. So it's not just the Labor side, but it does seem to me, in my lifetime, I was born in 1979, there's been one referendum. Is that right?
No, there was a bunch.
There's the one in the 80s.
Hawke put up quite a few
right.
together, again, like a block. So that's what I'm saying, is the centre-right, they'll ask one question at a time, whereas Labor has this idea. Though I suppose, actually, so 67 is 3.
When was the last Liberal or centre-right referendum? Was it 67?
99 is under Howard.
I know 99 is under Howard, yes, true.
The impetus behind it is very Keating, and sort of Howard had adopted a very neutral attitude to keep Liberal unity before the 1996 election, saying that I'll still have the referendum. You can still vote for me as a monarchist because I'll still have the referendum.
Yeah, but have the constitutional conventions, which of course then unpacked all the issues associated with changing our constitutional monarchy. But we've got sidetracked. So tell me about Joseph Cook's journey to the prime ministership. So he's in federal parliament, he's a free trader, he's part of the Reid team, and I know you're a huge fan of George Reid, Zach, so no doubt that's why you are a huge fan of Joseph Cook. Bit of affiliation there. But how does he make it? I mean, Reid's away a lot, isn't he? So he's becoming sort of an effective opposition leader, just filling in for George Reid. So he's at least giving a sense that he can do the job.
Yeah, so he's left out of the Reid-Maclean government because he'd been very sick just before, and because it is a coalition, so half the members are protectionists. But once the anti-socialist campaign gets going properly, he's elected deputy leader of the anti-socialists, and Reid is just not in Parliament for very long periods of time, both because he's going to this great effort to do the campaign, because the whole idea behind the anti-socialist campaign is that Australia still had very separate political cultures because all the colonies had so recently been independent that if you were going to make the nation as an imagined community into an actual manifested community, you would need to go around and speak and sort of create that unified political culture. So he's never there. So Cook functions as opposition leader, and the 1986 election falls short. There's a big swing to the anti-socialists in certain regards. Certainly, they receive over 47% of the vote in the Senate, which is more than 10 points higher than any other single party has ever received. Deakin's able to hold on with Labor support and pass the fully protected tariff, but he can see that the writing is on the wall and that a two-party system is inevitable, and he's not going to go left because he's not going to submit to the pledge. And the anti-socialists really want the two-party system because they are actually concerned about socialism really direly. They think that they're completely trying to remake what Australia is and what Australia will be. So to facilitate coming together and facilitate having the majority in Parliament where they'll be able to block any sort of attempt at socialism, George Reid resigns as leader of the anti-socialists because he knows that Deakin just hates him and will never deal with him. Cook's elected leader, and then he negotiates the fusion and becomes deputy in the Deakin-Cook Fusion Ministry, also known as the Commonwealth Liberal Party, and he's Minister for Defence at a time in the lead up to the First World War where really important things are happening. He found the Australian Navy by commissioning its first flagship, HMAS Australia. He passes the substantial 1909 Defence Act. He establishes the Royal Military College in Duntroon, and even sort of has this idea for establishing an Australian Air Force by offering a £5,000 prize for the design of a military aircraft.
Well, I mean, in terms of Australia's defence, development of our defence, he makes an enormous contribution, I would say. One of the many things he should be remembered for. He does become Prime Minister in 1913 for, as you said earlier on, only 450 days, and the shortest serving Prime Minister of any Prime Minister who has won an election. Why was it so short? What was the big failure?
So, yeah, the fusion gets smashed at the 1910 election, and Deakin holds on as opposition leader for a little bit. He only retires with about 100 days to go before the election, and Cook leads the Liberals to this election victory with this argument that's very much against socialism. He has an election campaign that's simultaneous with these referendums. So he's really helped by that. It's no longer George Reed's sort of nebulous theoretical socialist tiger. It's a very real and direct animal, and he wins 7 seats. And he's the first centre-right leader to win a majority government. For me, this is a really landmark moment in Australian political history because it's what proves that the natural sort of fault lines of Australian politics are a central-right liberalism defending an existing and successful liberal order against Labor's attempts to change and interfere with it. But even though he picks up 7 seats, because Deakin and the Fusion had lost a full 16 seats at the 1910 election, it was an absolute wipeout. Picking up 7 seats is only enough for a 1-seat majority, and he gets less Senate seats than he's entitled to because at the time you didn't have proportional representation in how the Senate was elected. You just had, say, there's 3 senators being elected for your state, you had 3 votes. So if you voted for the full Labor ticket and the Labor ticket got the higher sort of ratio in the state, it tended to take all of the seats. So he has an obstructionist Senate and he decides to risk a double dissolution because he's not a time server. He's not content just having 3 years at the highest salary he's ever achieved. He instead wants to directly lead this fight for what Australia should be. And there's 2 issues he picks out, which are quite sort of interesting issues. One of the more minor ones that he tries to go to the double dissolution on is to reintroduce postal votes, because he had this idea that you needed to have access to the franchise. So that's a really important thing to him. And Labor had abolished postal votes because the stereotype at the time was only rich women who would do this, who would vote via post because they didn't want to deal with the riffraff at the polling booth. So Labor was happy to get rid of it because they were getting rid of people who were going to vote against Labor anyway. But then the more philosophical issue, which is actually what the sort of preconditions for a double dissolution are fought on, is preference to unionists in government employment. So Labor had won in 1910 so successfully that they also had control of the Senate, so they're able to do whatever they want within the bounds of the Constitution. And one of the things they do is pass legislation that anyone who's a union member will be automatically favoured for a government job. And considering Labor had deliberately politicised the union movement, it essentially meant that a man's political affiliation determined his ability to access a taxpayer-funded salary. And despite his connections to the union movement, Cook thought this was utterly appalling. So he fights the 1914 election on the basis of that, in the hope of winning the Senate and actually being able to get things accomplished. But the First World War breaks out and the Governor-General says to Cook, you can't keep campaigning, you have to come focus exclusively on war matters. There's certain things we do while Cook is Prime Minister with regards to the war, like offering 20,000 troops, taking over the German islands in the South Pacific, all these sorts of things. And at a time when in-person campaigning was so important that Reed had absented himself for Parliament for months at a time as opposition leader to lead an in-person campaign, without being able to do that, he never really stood a chance at winning the 1914 election. The result is really bad in terms of seats. It looks worse on paper than it actually is as far as sort of votes and swing. It's not as bad as what Deakin had done in 1910, but it still is a pretty devastating electoral loss.
So what are they left with?
You're putting me on the spot. A very large margin as far as terms of seats in a House of Representatives that's half the size roughly of what it is today. So majority of 10 is a majority of 20 in modern terms.
Yeah, of course. Yes, it's a much smaller parliament. So someone I wanted to ask you about who is a perennial character in Australian politics, well, at least in the first part of the 20th century, is Billy Hughes. And he, talk about Labor rats. He's one of them, one of the lineup. Tell me about Cook's relationship with Billy Hughes. I mean, no one had a good relationship with Billy Hughes, so it's par for the course.
Yeah,
but they really loathed each other, didn't they?
They really did. So Hughes is very much the embodiment of caucus Labor, ironically. He comes in 1894 as one of these people who are ousting the independent Labor men. It's Hughes that precipitates the fall of the Reed government in New South Wales politics by being one of the so-called Solid Six, members of caucus who threaten to resign if caucus doesn't agree to oust the Reid government. As far as Cook's concerned, they clash heavily because Hughes keeps having a go at him in federal parliament as a Labor rat, ironically. That's the thing he hates him most about. He compares Cook to Satan repeatedly in the House of Representatives and is sort of scolded by the speakers to, please, can you stop referring to Satan? And Cook, for his part, refers to Hughes as that little devil, apparently, that they just absolutely hate each other. But the irony ends up being just like the irony after Cook had spent so much time arguing against Alfred Deakin, he ends up in government with him. When push comes to shove and Labor split over conscription in the Great War, Cook ultimately decides to keep Hughes in office. And he plays a really central role in how the whole thing pans out because Cook is actually really reluctant towards conscription. He's not a jingoist. He's not like a lot of people on the centre-right who really immediately into conscription. He's got too much of that freedom of conscience idea in him. He has 3 sons enlisted in the AAF, one of whom's shot through the face at Gallipoli but miraculously survives. But he ultimately just determines that the war is necessary for Australia's survival. And if the war is absolutely necessary, then you need stability in government and you have to keep the little devil in office if that's what it means to have stability in government.
Yeah, well, the little devil remains in Parliament, causing all sorts of trouble for many years after that. Cook obviously loses the 1914 election and then leaves politics not too long after it, does he?
No, he is the opposition leader for those war years, and he's the one who leads the Liberals into becoming the Nationalists. So he, first of all, keeps Billy Hughes in office just as a minority government, but then as things are hotting up in the war in the lead up to the 1917 election, again, the Governor-General was extremely politically active back then. He actually says, no, the Hughes Laborites and the Liberals need to come together to form a more stable government. So Cook is actually Deputy Prime Minister, or at least de facto Deputy Prime Minister, from 1917 to 1921. He's Hughes's treasurer. He goes to Versailles with Hughes. He's an official signatory of the Treaty of Versailles. He even helps to draw up the borders of Czechoslovakia. He gets put on that committee, even though he knows very little about, obviously, borders of Czechoslovakia should be. He makes the decision to make them really generous, which leads to Hitler's calls for annexation. It's just a bizarre...
Yeah, well, I guess he certainly would have come to it with a degree of neutrality, given he didn't know much about it. But he does become one of those long list of Australian High Commissioners to Britain who had been an Australian Prime Minister as well, doesn't he, after politics?
Yeah, so he's the 3rd High Commissioner, and the High Commissioner at the time was a huge posting. It's really difficult to comprehend how important it was back then. Australia didn't have other diplomatic missions. We just had a representative in Britain talking directly at the epicenter of the empire about important matters.
Which is why we had so many former Prime Ministers end up being Australian High Commissioner to Britain, because it was just so important, the
role. Yes,
yeah.
Certainly. So it had been George Reid, then Andrew Fisher, then Cook. And Cook essentially plays a pivotal role in Australian politics of the 1920s because the 1920s is defined by the Bruce Page government, and it has all these grand schemes of national development, which all cost an awful lot of money. So to be able to afford them, you need to be able to get loans from Britain. And the Bruce Page government is borrowing so much money that at a certain point, the Bank of England says no. So Cook has to raise Australia's first loan of US dollars to fund the schemes of the Bruce
First of many, no doubt.
Yeah, definitely. So he has that role as High Commissioner. He also has what we previously talked about as far as selling Australia to migrants.
Yeah, very successfully.
And then he's also Australia's chief representative at the League of Nations in Geneva. So he literally is combining every single diplomatic role that what would be hundreds of people now is all embodied in this single person in Cook in Europe in the 1920s.
Well, given his work ethic, I'm not surprised he was still able to achieve that. He is a remarkable figure in Australian history, well worth reading about, well worth getting your book, Zach, on Joseph Cook from Connor Court, and it's been wonderful to speak to you today.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.